Okay, I think it's time to talk about the jumbo jet in the room. And the website Shameplane provides some interesting perspective. Check this out. If I click on economy and round trip, for departure city, I'll put in London. And for arrival, I'll put in Los Angeles, LAX. And you can see how much Arctic ice disappears from that. Now that's the 3.4 tons of CO2. Now if I say we're going vegetarian for an entire year, recycle for a year, only use LED lights, reduce your food waste to zero, use a reusable shopping bag, only eat local food, and live car free, and do all that stuff for an entire year, and it still doesn't make up for that one round trip flight. Now, I'm guessing you don't want to stop traveling. I don't want to. And destinations certainly don't want you to stop visiting them, and airlines and hotels and travel agents don't want you to stop, and billions of dollars are getting spent every year on advertising to get us to travel. Economies of nations and cities around the world are depending on it. Tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people are depending on us to keep traveling. On the other hand, it's killing our planet, and we sort of need that to survive. So what's the plan? Is there anything destinations can do, travel agents can do, we can do, without completely compromising our ability to move around freely? Today I'm going to talk to this guy and see if maybe he has some of the answers.
Somebody told me that offsetting is like paying someone else not to sleep, not to cheat on their partner so that you can cheat on yours. And I think that really is, it's a little tongue in cheek, right? But that's how I think about offsetting. Right? The reality is that the physical world that we live in is under a lot of pressure, and we're going to have to adapt our social constructs, including how we live. And it's either going to happen voluntarily really quickly, or it's going to be thrust upon us. Because traveling closer to home and promoting tourism close to home is very resilient.
I want to speak to Rodney Payne today on this topic. He's an Australian currently based in Canada. Ages ago, he founded a social media marketing company to help destinations attract those younger, hipper travelers using social media. He was part of the industrialized marketing apparatus that enticed people to get on planes and travel across oceans to see stuff. Today, about 20 years later, he's decided to refocus his approach. Or maybe you could say he's gone back to his earlier days, his background as an environmental lawyer. Today I want to talk about carbon offsetting, being sustainable while traveling, and it's a bit of a conundrum. You sent me a site that said that if I take one long trip, there's basically nothing I can do with my lifestyle. If I'm recycling, bicycling everywhere, going vegan, everything I can do is barely going to add up to that one long trip. Is that correct from your standpoint?
Yeah, that was my massive awakening as a travel professional who was concerned about my footprint on the earth, was the impact of a flight compared to anything else I could do in a year being so huge.
So the question then becomes, what do we do? Let's talk about the offsetting stuff.
Yeah.
Is all that good? Is some of it good? Is most of it good in your opinion, or is it just a bunch of greenwashing?
I think I've probably formed a conclusion that it's net bad. I think there's some offsetting or some types of offsetting that can be really good for biodiversity or for communities. But I think the fallacy that you can pay a few dollars on top of your airline flight to alleviate your guilt on a one-to-one basis is very strong, right? That's it. And that I think is the social aspect to the challenge of offsetting. Is it stops us from confronting the real problem and actually leading to the innovation and behavior change needed to truly make our industry sustainable.
What vision pops into your head with some of these schemes? I mean, for me, it's like some guy in Brazil loading a baby sapling tree into the back of his Tesla, driving it to the edge of the rainforest, digging a hole by hand and planting it, and then heading back to town. Yeah. If it was even true, what kind of pops into your head when you think of these offsetting schemes?
So there's various ways to offset, right? You can pay people with less income than you to buy cleaner cook stoves so they're not polluting as much as they are right now. They're often on the other side of the planet. and it has very little personal accountability attached to it.
And again, I'm going to start off with this little mental picture I get where it says often these airlines are saying, tick this box, we'll add $5 to your fee or some kind of number like that. And then you will have a sustainable aviation fuel experience when you fly. And the way I'm imagining is one of those giant, airline petrol tank vehicles that comes out, puts the little nozzle into the wing from below and fills it up with airline fuel. And then I kind of imagine a little tiny truck that comes out for those 4 people who tick that box and puts, $20 worth extra, tops it up that last 0.01% and then drives off. Because you can mix those things.
Yeah.
I don't see that. I don't understand that, how that even works. When you have 4 people on a flight who've ticked that box, how does that add up to you?
Yeah, I think that at the moment the net impact is negligible, right? But you've got to think about the signals that we send with our choices. And you've got to think about how R&D and how innovation happens, right? It's very small and very gentle and off to the side and quietly at the beginning, and then it's everything all at once. And so if you're asking whether I think sustainable aviation fuels is the silver bullet for aviation, it's the thing that keeps the current system in play, right? Because you can use the current infrastructure in theory. But when you start doing the math on how much sustainable aviation fuel we need and where that comes from and what that competes with, you start realizing that puts pressure on the food and water systems that underpin civilization.
Right, so just to bring people up to speed, like supposedly it's coming from our used cooking oil for those people who remember to collect it and somehow, I don't know, drive it over to the airport or leave it somewhere where it gets taken to the airport. But more and more I hear that it's coming from, virgin palm forests in Indonesia and the like. Is that what you're hearing as well?
I think there's crops that will be grown for ethanol and kerosene and are being grown. I think that the challenge is that we'll typically gravitate to the path of least resistance, right? So there's a number of ways to produce it. If we can produce it from waste at scale, we've got a real solution to the problem. But we've got to remember as well that sustainable aviation fuel, as it's been named, still burns in the atmosphere. It still releases fossil fuels. It still creates radiative forcing. It's not some magical thing. It's just that the life cycle is less impacted because we're effectively recycling and keeping the carbon in the system.
I've read it burns 3 to 4 times cleaner.
Yeah, I think that's in the realm of the realm of projections.
Okay, let's get back. Well, there's 2 more things. So one is the community thing, and the other one is these giant machines. And I remember seeing this on 60 Minutes, and I was just riveted. I'm thinking, finally, this is the savior solution we've been looking for. This kind of giant contraption, like almost from a Dr. Seuss book, that somehow magically sucks carbon out of our atmosphere. Talk about that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of very smart engineers and scientists who've realized that we have an imbalance in our atmosphere that's making the world warmer. And they've set out to use their powers to try and look for ways to fix it. And you've got companies like Climeworks over in, they're based in Switzerland, but they're sort of direct air capture plant up in Iceland that runs on geothermal energy, pulls a very small amount of carbon out of the air, and it sequesters it, and then that can be stored forever underground as long as there's no challenges with storage. And then over here in North America, pretty close to where I live in Squamish, there's a company called Carbon Engineering, and they've also been doing it. And you've got giant machines with fans that pull air out and cause. They have processes that cause the carbon molecules to come out of the atmosphere and bond to something else. Now, the challenge is there aren't...
Fuel from that too. The 60 Minutes piece I saw, it was creating fuel by sucking this out that they could then use.
Yeah, well, carbon is the building block for life, right? Like everything you see around you has some element of carbon in it, right? So there's companies using carbon and CO2 to create all kinds of things. There's vodka made out of carbon. I recently brought home some soap made out of carbon, put it in the shower. You can make aviation fuel out of carbon, and I think in future we'll start to see much more of a closed loop system where we realize that what we currently see as a waste or a pollution is actually a massive resource.
Well, I want to throw something at you, which is that when I was at an aviation conference in Saudi a couple of years ago, I was speaking with an industry insider and talking about this thing and saying what an amazing thing it was. Isn't this something that all airlines are investing in? And he said, yeah. He said, I think it may have so far caused more harm than good. I was like, what? How is that possible? He said, well, it's kind of a lot of people who've heard about this start thinking, now we have a solution. We can just keep on flying and doing whatever, not have to worry about it. Just later down the road, as this thing gets better, we'll just suck it out of the atmosphere later. We've all been saved. We're good for now, and we've averted the crisis. And it's getting people to take less action and take it less seriously than they should. And so that was his take. And then also he added on top of that, maybe aside from the geothermal example you gave in Iceland, is that they require a lot of energy to pull this carbon out. So they're using it, and it would be more efficient if you put up solar panels and other things to just use those to power something else instead of powering this to remove a smaller amount of carbon.
Yeah, and I think you hit on the key there. This is an energy problem, right? The carbon in the atmosphere is a massive and dangerous symptom of that problem. But when it comes to flying or things like direct air capture using the current technology in operation, and I say current really carefully because technology can grow and change very, very rapidly, right? But if you look at the current math of flying around the world or pulling CO2 molecules out of the sky and trying to get them to bond with something else, that's very, very energy intensive. And we have, at the moment, access to a relatively finite amount of energy, and that's scaling really quickly through renewables, especially as solar's become really affordable. But in the decades to come, the ones that are going to really matter, we've got to make some serious changes. And I don't think we should be betting on some massive panacea when it comes to how to power some of these machines we use and depend on at the moment.
Okay. There's two more things I want to get on. One was the community thing. I want to save that for last. But before we get there, there's the airline industry that is introducing, whether it's hydrogen-powered planes or electric planes or some of these new like double rotary looking funky things I've seen Airbus putting online, even some hybrid things. Do you think the airline industry is going to figure this out before it's too late?
I look at the cost projections of carbon removal as sort of one of the things that guides my thinking in that area. And if you think about the cost of removing carbon as projected by a lot of the big forecasters, it's going to cost hundreds of dollars per ton of carbon, right? So whenever I go and look at the cost of removing my carbon from the atmosphere when I take a flight, it usually doubles or triples the cost of that flight.
Wow.
I think we should do a live calculation here so that we're not throwing out inaccurate numbers, because I want to say your 1 ton is probably a bit low. So let's look at, I'm gonna pull this up on my browser here while we're talking.
Okay.
Okay.
Because I just want, you got it in front of you?
Yeah, I got it in front of me. So Heathrow to JFK, you're looking at just under 3,500 miles or 5,500 kilometers. 2 metric tons round trip emissions. So 1 per way, like you said, of direct CO2 equivalent. So that counts the other greenhouse gases as well. Okay. And this is the same as being vegetarian for about three and a half years, or carpooling for 2 years. So the one thing that doesn't take into account is something called radiative forcing, which is a relatively new, new in terms of years concept, where we realize that the impact of aviation is bigger than just the CO2 burned because it's happening in the upper atmosphere. And right. there's also other impacts of flying that cause greater warming. So it further complicates something that's already really complicated, but you can basically double that. Right. At the moment, 1.9 times radiative forcing is sort of the scientific consensus.
The price to remove those 2 tons for a round trip ticket.
Yeah, so
It's going to be how much?
let's talk. Well, so right now, if you go onto Climeworks and try and do that, it's going to cost you around $1,000 a ton. How does travel become part of the solution? You have the wealthiest people in the world getting on airplanes, right? I forget what the data before COVID was. I have no idea what it was now, but it's something like 20% of people have ever been on an airplane, and around 6% get on one every year. And then, that curves up exponentially among the people who are doing it a lot. Most of those people are in a position of power influence, right? They run governments and they run businesses and they work in businesses and have jobs that they can impact. They're consumers and they spend money. They're the people we can teach and we can educate about some of the things they maybe don't know at the moment. So let's say flying actually costs more than we're currently charging for it, right? There's externalities that are not being factored in. Our industry is very likely only viable because we ignore the externalities. I think if you were to charge the true cost at this moment of the externalities, we're not profitable as an industry. And many sectors within the travel industry wouldn't turn a profit if we weren't able to pollute for free. So you have to ask yourself, when in your part of the world is polluting for free no longer going to be allowed, and start planning for that really quickly. And how do you become part of the solution so that the travel experience is so incredibly valuable and so much a part of the transition that we need to make as a global civilization that it's indispensable, right? And this is where what Barcelona and Greece have done recently gets really interesting. So Greece, I think a couple of months ago now, put in place a climate and resilience fee. And it's only a few dollars, but on every passenger coming in, there's now a few dollar fee on climate resilience. It's a good concept. So Barcelona now have committed $100 million to help schools and people in their community to buy heat pumps, which is magical technology. And I think they're investing in other things like solar panels, which brings the cost down for people locally and helps to accelerate the transition to a cleaner world, right? And if, while aviation is rapidly innovating, tourism can be the industry that spreads ideas around, lets people see that it's not that scary to overcome all the different barriers and resistance to change that we innately have as humans, and can also fund the green transition using the wealth of the people who are privileged enough to travel, then you've probably got a case to make that travel should continue on a burning planet.
Okay, so let me just see if I can wrap my head around some of this stuff. What they're saying is, instead of giving $5 or $10 or $20 to some kind of carbon offsetting scheme, they're saying, here's this little similar sized chunk of change that we're demanding or forcing you to hand over, and we're going to take that, and instead of protecting some magical forest or driving a plant to the edge of the rainforest in Brazil or something like that, what we're going to do is something we actually know works. We're going to put a solar panel on a school or a heat pump over here. Now they could take those $5 and say, we want to use that to increase the size of our purse to innovate in the airline industry, so we can get some of this stuff to market quicker. But they're instead saying, we'll let the airlines worry about that. We're going to take this fee in the meantime and put up solar panels, which we can do within weeks or months or days, and put this to action immediately.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the concept?
Yeah, I think so. It's an insetting concept. So instead of offsetting as a community or as a destination, we can inset our emissions. And again, don't get me wrong, don't think that there's enough insetting to be done to offset major tourism volume. But this is where really carefully thought out strategy comes into play, because we're not talking about less people in a place, visiting a place. We're talking about less unique people flitting all over the world on a whim. You can go for longer and still have the same level of visitation in a place. And I think we've lost that really important nuance in a lot of these discussions, and our brains quickly jump to shorthand things, right? We jump from, there's lots of pollution, so we have to cut back travel. Well, actually, if you were to travel for twice as long every second year, you'd halve your emissions and your level of nights away wouldn't change, right? That's not good news for the aviation sector, but for the rest of the tourism industry, it's perfectly acceptable.
So should the businesses embrace something like that, saying instead of getting your summer months off, we're going to give you 0 months off this year, but next year you get twice as much? I mean, can companies survive that way? Is that realistic to ask them to allow their employees to do something like that? Or is that just happening anyway with this hybrid lifestyle where people are working from home more, and or are they just using that to travel more? I mean, is it, what do you say?
I think those are all social constructs, right? The reality is that the physical world that we live in is under a lot of pressure, and we're going to have to adapt our social constructs, including how we live. And it's either going to happen voluntarily really quickly, or it's going to be thrust upon us. Because traveling closer to home and promoting tourism close to home is very resilient, right? The destinations that weren't dependent on long haul did a lot better through and after the pandemic because they weren't dependent on international visitors. The same thing is true when a natural disaster takes a tourism destination offline. If you've booked your once in a year or once in a lifetime trip and you miss the timing, that's done, right? You're not coming a month or 2 months later. But if you had, for you, a long weekend planned in Copenhagen next weekend and Copenhagen has a rain event, well, you're just going to reschedule and go a few weeks later, right?
Right. So Gothenburg, or Western Sweden, and that part of the world on that side of Sweden, has said we can't be a sustainable destination if we're having people flying in from all over the world. So what they decided to do is to only market the paid marketing within 500 kilometers of the destination, saying, and hopefully people either have short flights or better yet, trains to get there, or buses. And that way, but the thing is, they're not going to stop people at the airport if someone's getting off the plane from China, or they're not going to ban a flight coming in from further away, but they are going to only use their marketing money in that respect. Now, that maybe works in Europe, but what about a Caribbean island, or these places where they can't survive on the people within 500 kilometers? How does that play?
Yeah, I think that's where the leakage lever becomes really important, right? And if you sort of imagine 10 or 15 years down the path where the younger generations becoming, the 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds of tomorrow are a lot more frightened about the world they're seeing in their future, it's going to be a lot less acceptable to fly across the world for 4 or 5 days to have a Mai Tai on the beach on a tropical island, right? I think the heart surgeon that's volunteering a month to go and help, hundreds of kids, through a volunteer program probably always gets a hall pass and other things like that. So you have to think about why we travel, right? Can the need and the experience of that relaxation on a beach be provided in another way? Or could it be a 3-month trip instead of a 1-week trip, right? Could we rethink how we're doing things until a point where the way we move people and things around the world has adapted? But that also comes back to leakage, right? Because I care very deeply about the developing world and them being left behind in a way that you mentioned, right? It's completely unfair. But many of those economies are extractive and the profits are going offshore anyway in the way that's working at the moment, right? If you look at the leakage statistics from some of the islands in places like the Caribbean, in some cases it's up to 90% of the income is leaving the island. That's the problem we need to be fixing. If you could halve that, you could halve the volume of unique visitors coming to the island. You could get them to stay an extra night or two. You could decrease the environmental impact and carbon emissions while increasing the local economy. That's what we really need to be focused on.